Obrigado, Maria, and I'd like to thank the Foundation, of course, for inviting me to come and speak to this, I think, highly unusual conference, and I think one that is just the beginning of activities and understanding that will take place here in Portugal. It's my first time in your beautiful country, and I'm certainly looking forward, after all the work is done, to go out and see all the beautiful things that are out there. When I saw the initial title of this conference, which is the Present and the Future, it seemed to be almost a perfect way to talk about a demographic type conference. Because in our population today, we can see many things. Of course, we can see the present, but we can also see the past. And I think even more important, we have a rather good idea of what may happen in the future. So the title of this is the talk, is One World, Two Populations. And what's interesting is when I began in the field in the 1970s, and then when I went to work at Population Reference Bureau in the 1980, that the only thing people asked about really was population growth in developing countries. Developing countries meaning Africa, Asia, Latin America. And just to keep things short today and to keep things quite realistic, we can call them the poor countries. There was a famous philosopher in France in the early 19th century, Auguste Comte, and he came up with the oft-quoted phrase that demography is destiny. Destiny is an interesting word. You can maybe it's something you can't change, but maybe it's something you can change. Now we will be taking a close look at these things. Here we see the great concern about population growth in the world. This is 1960, Time magazine. And it's a very early time, really, for there to be concern about population growth in developing countries. 3 years later, this magazine asked a rather provocative question: are there too many people in the world? Also, just for fun, notice that bottom quote: pollution of US air and water. How serious? We were just beginning, I think, to learn things about the world that we had not yet considered. Was this concern of population growth justified at the time? In 1900, now, after all, we've been here for 50,000 years. In 1900, world population stood at 1.6 billion. So it had taken us our entire history to reach that figure of 1.6, 50,000 years. What do you think it was 100 years later? And it's always kind of fun when something like this happens in statistics. In the year 2000, those two numbers just changed places to 6.1 billion. Now, this is one of my candidates for one of the 7 wonders of world history, that we went from 1.6 billion to 6.1 in only 100 years. And today, the growth continues. We are currently adding about 1 billion people to world population every 12 years. The 7th, as you can see, the 6th came in 12 years. The 8th billion, who knows? It could be 13 if we look at United Nations projections, or it could be 12 or less. We simply don't know that yet. And here's a picture an overall picture that really has not changed very much, even as long as I've been in this field. That virtually all population growth in the world will take place in the poorest countries. But we have the developing countries, and also a new part of those the United Nations has designated the least developed countries. And down below you can see, well, us, the rich countries, the West. There's no growth shown there whatsoever anymore, and that's a bit of a turnaround from 30 years ago, when the UN, in fact, was projecting that population growth in developed countries would continue. Some of these slides will be shown, all of this presentation, by the way, will be on the Foundation website. So when there are a lot of numbers, we'll just highlight it today, and you can come back and look at them later at your leisure. But you can see here that by the year 2050, that less developed countries will have about 8 billion people, and we can see that Europe, the European Union, and North America, growth is either very small or non-existent. Where the biggest growth is, and this I think is quite surprising when you think that Asia is such a large area with such a large population, that most of world population growth between now and 2050 will in fact be in sub-Saharan Africa, and that's not very far away, and I'm sure many of you are familiar with many countries there. That is where the growth will be, and these truly, I think, are areas that cannot afford it. Well, how can we be so certain of this? Well, here's a few pyramids, but these aren't the ones I wanted to talk about. You may all be familiar with population pyramids that show the age structure of an area or a country. With the older people at the top, there's fewer older people, so they tend to be smaller. And down at the bottom, you have all the young people, so where they spread out at the base. Here's the pyramid now of the developed countries, and this is Europe, North America, Japan, Australia, and New Zealand. In other words, the rich countries of the world. It doesn't look like much of a pyramid, does it? So this is what tells us that we have a certain destiny ahead of us. It may be unavoidable, and maybe it won't be. We'll discuss that later. But let's compare that now to the poor countries and what their pyramid looks like. A little bit of a difference. Here we see a vast group of world population with very young ages. They have some control, in a sense, maybe more than we do, over their destiny, in that if they lower their birth rates, their growth may not be as great as we have predicted, and if they don't, their growth may be greater than projected. But I think this is one of the most dramatic things you can see in world population today. Well, how did this happen? How did we go from 1.6 to 6.1? Here we see a graph of birth and death rates in Sweden going back to the middle of the 18th century, and they have good records. Many European countries do. One thing we notice here, the green line on the top and the black line for the death rate. You have the birth rate and the death rate. They never get that far apart, do they? They tend to follow one another along. So as this particular country began to urbanize and people moved away from farms and into cities, then the birth rate began to come down. But so did the death rate, as public health measures and such things helped raise life expectancy and lower infant mortality. Still, we notice some peaks in that death rate, don't we? This shows how for many centuries, the human race took like 3 steps forward and 2 steps back, or 2 steps forward and 3 steps back, as mortality rose during times of famine and plague and wars. But notice how that kind of disappears as we come up to the more modern period in the 21st century, that we don't see those big jumps in mortality anymore. That death rate and the birth rate, the difference, only about 1%, a 1% growth rate. Now we look at a typical developing country, Mexico. And what happened here is that many of the health measures and the public health measures that it took us hundreds of years to develop, such as washable clothing, recognizing that germs cause disease. It took us centuries to do that. Yet in the 20th century, we were able to quickly export all of these things to developing countries. And a good thing happened. Their death rates went down. That's the black line on the bottom. You notice that the green line, however, the birth rate did not come down the same way it did in Sweden, at least not right away. So what we have here is a growth rate that reached something like 3%. And an important point here is that that has never happened before in human history. That's something brand new. And that's why we were so concerned about global population growth in the 70s and the 80s and so on. Here we can see quickly how life expectancy rose. The green line at the top is life expectancy at birth in the United States. And we can see how Sri Lanka and Costa Rica caught right up to us in a very short period of time. So life expectancy in developing countries quickly rose to be equal and sometimes even greater than some developed countries. This is why we have that 1.6 to 6.1.
Temos 6.1 em
Here's
vez de
another graph you can look at later too that shows how life expectancy rose in various countries. In India, it was 39 in 1950. Can you imagine today having a life expectancy of 39 in Portugal or any other developed country? Yet they've quickly caught up with us, and that's good news.
Mas eles
A lot of
rapidamente
that has
chegaram ao mesmo
happened by
nível que nós,
reducing infant mortality.
através da redução da mortalidade
It
infantil.
was once true that if you had 5 children in a developing country, 2 may die before their first birthday, 2 out of 5. And yet another one might die before the 5th birthday.
Terceiro morria antes dos 5 anos.
How do populations change?
Como é que
The
as
purple line
populações
is the number
evoluem?
of births,
A roxa
and the
temos
gray one, the number of
o
deaths.
número de nascimentos e a cinzenta o
Notice
número
how
de
on the
mortes.
right
Vejam como
we
do
have
lado
Europe
direito temos a Europa,
and North America, and you
América
can
do
see how the
Norte, e
births
vê-se
and deaths
como
are almost equal in
nascimento
those
e
areas.
morte são praticamente
Yet in
idênticos
the
nessas
developing
zonas,
countries
mas nos
there is
países em
still
vias de
a wide
desenvolvimento
gap
continua a haver
due
uma
to the younger
grande,
population and also, of
grande
course,
grande
the higher
intervalo
birth rates.
devido à população jovem e à taxa
This
elevada
is
de
something I call the
natalidade.
demographic
Isto é o que eu
divide, and
chamo
this
divisão
is often very
demográfica
popular in
e é
newspapers
muito popular
because it does give a very
na imprensa porque dá
contrast
contraste, este
between
fosso
a developing
demográfico
country and a developed. Here we have Rwanda and Portugal.
uma imagem muito
They're
clara.
just
Reparem no
about the
Ruanda
same
e em Portugal,
size.
tem praticamente a
But look at
mesma
some of the other
área, mas
things as
reparem
we go
noutros
down.
aspectos.
The number of births in Rwanda is about 350,000.
355
The
mil
number
no
of deaths,
Ruanda, o número de
113.
mortes é
Whereas if
113.
you look at Portugal, around 97,000 births per year, and the number of deaths is actually greater. There's also some sad things here, I think, as well. The number of infant deaths in Rwanda is close to 18,000 per year, whereas in Portugal, a country of the same size, only about 300. That, to me, is a rather sad thing. Now, the population projection there we see for Portugal over on the right-hand side for the year 2050, it's a bit of an old one. And the foundation and its associates have done a new projection of Portugal's population, which is coming up later today. And I'm going to be there, and I think you're going to find it pretty interesting should you attend that session. So what happened to the birth rate? At the top left, we have what we often think of as a typical family around the turn of the 20th century. On the right, we have a family planning poster from Korea. Just have 2. This was back in the 1970s. So what happened then to the birth rate in the wealthy countries? Well, here we see a graph that shows a bunch of different countries, a little bit of spaghetti in a single graph. And we notice that it's split into 2 groups, really. The birth rate came down in all developed countries. In a few, it bounced back or it remained a little bit higher, while the vast group of them stayed down rather low. And a point for discussion later, I think, is, why is this? Why is there a difference? We all saw our birth rate come down, but why did it come down more in some countries than in others? The Eastern European example, too, I think is very interesting. It shows what happened immediately after the Soviet Union broke up and the Warsaw Pact came to an end. You can see how countries such as Poland, they had relatively high birth rates, but once the economy fell apart, then it came right back down. Portugal's rate now, there's one point I want to make because some people, I think today, in the country have the feeling that Portugal has the only really low birth rate in Europe. We've seen that's not true. It's a little lower than the EU in general, but it's not that different. One thing, of course, is that it used to be when you came out of college, when I was a young man, that you simply went and had children. That was the end of that. I mean, that's what you were expected to do, and that's what you did. Today, things have changed so much for the younger generation that we can see that childbearing peaks at a much higher rate age. They're about 30, whereas Portugal on the top in 1960, you can see how high it was, that you came out of school, you had children. When you look at the bottom one, you can see that that's not really happening anymore. The average age in Portugal is very typical of a first birth is about 30 years of age for a woman. Natural increase is a demographer's term, simply meaning births minus deaths. And we can see how they came to an equilibrium over the years since 1950. So what's left? There was a very interesting documentary on educational TV in the United States about low birth rates, and they were looking at Japan. And there was a professor or a teacher who was up at a blackboard writing on it and teaching to the students. But then the camera comes back and there's only one pupil. There's only one student. And I thought that was one of the most dramatic things I had seen in some time, and really brought home what low birth rates can mean. The bottom we see some retirees, and there are going to be more and more and more retirees. The result is that in the case of Portugal, that we've gone from about 1/4 of the population below the age of 15 to about 15%. So we have that purple bar shows the percent under 15, and this is a very important one. The gray bar is that of 65 and over, which is the usual retirement ages. So here's Portugal's pyramid in 1970, and it has that rather broad base. And in 1970, no developing country was really talking much about the birth rate. Nobody was really concerned about it, but that has changed significantly. We look at Portugal now from the most recent census, and here we see an example again of destiny and how we can see three things, not just one. We see the past, we see the present today, and this gives us a very good idea of what the future may be. What can be done in the future, and how can that be changed? If Portugal or any other country maintains its birth rate, then we can see right away that we'll continue to have smaller and smaller number of young people. Will that turn around? That is a point not just for this discussion, but I think for the entire conference. And how about developing countries? There are developing countries whose lower birth rates look a lot like Europe, and they look a lot like the US, although these tend to be some of the wealthier countries, where incomes have risen much more than, say, in South Asia or through Africa. Now when we look at Africa, Africa is an area that's beginning to become one of great concern. Surveys are taken in developing countries to measure the birth rate, the percentage of women who are using family planning, all that type of thing. And what's happening in Africa, in sub-Saharan Africa, is the birth rate is not coming down. In fact, just last week before I came here, we had a survey from Côte d'Ivoire. And demographers were guessing that women in Côte d'Ivoire averaged about 4.4 children. Well, it came in at 5, so here we go back up again. A key point here, of course, for population growth in any country is at what point will it reach 2 children per couple, 2 children per woman? At that point, eventually, population growth will simply slowly come to an end. What do you think the prospects now are for sub-Saharan Africa? At a lower level, but similar, are other countries such as Pakistan and Indonesia and Egypt. Notice how the birth rate has come down, but it doesn't really come quickly down to 2 children. it goes a little bit flat. So if we were to look, for example, at, say, Pakistan, in our mind's eye, we can take that line all the way out. When do you think it might reach 2 children? What might make it happen to come down to that? And while some of these birth rates don't seem very high, they actually are. And they will continue fairly rapid population growth for some time into the future. Another quick example showing a country that has had very great success in lowering the birth rate, but notice when it gets to 2, it kind of slows down. As part of our global view, we'll take a quick look at the US, and this was a wonderful cover in The Economist some years back that showed how many Europeans viewed the United States as being a very pregnant Statue of Liberty, having children, while Europe was an older man with a beer belly and all of this. And it's a little bit of a stereotype. We're not quite like that. The United States has not been immune to the effects of recession. This is our average number of children going back to about 1960, and you can see on the left the end of our much celebrated and remarkable baby boom. Well, that came to an end. And today, well, the US is often said to average 2 or 2.1 children. That's not quite the case anymore. It's about 1.9. So for now, at least, the US has joined some of the lower fertility countries of Europe with a birth rate below the replacement level. Now here's another pyramid. If I hadn't put a label on it, you might wonder what it is. This is the long traditional so-called majority population of the United States. And this is basically those of us who are of European origin going all the way back to the 17th century almost. So this has typically been called the majority. But we got a little complicated, so now we have to call it white non-Hispanic because we have a very large number of Hispanics. But notice that this pyramid looks a lot like a European pyramid. So that the majority population of the US is in fact not growing at all in terms of births and deaths. In fact, the number of births and deaths are about the same. It is the immigrants that keep a country young today for the most part in a developed country like the US. We now have about 1 in 6 of our population is of Hispanic heritage, which basically means Latin America, and mostly from Mexico. But these people, as they come in, they have a higher birth rate, and they help keep the population young. Although one thing I think we miss, they're going to age too. They will get older and older, because much of this immigration has been fairly recent. One thing that has changed dramatically worldwide is the way we come together, the way we form families. Throughout many countries of Europe, it was always true that childbearing was inside of marriage. Marriage took place rather early in life, and divorce was less frequent than it is today. Much of that has changed. In Portugal, we have a complicated graph here that shows the percent of women who were married and men at a particular age, and we notice quickly how that's changed. So the purple bar, the third one, is 25 to 29, and today we have, there were about 46% only of males are married, and 60% of females. And actually, these numbers are a little higher than some other developed countries. But we can see that marriage is really being delayed. Why is that? Well, because I think that the younger generation coming in today has more choices. For one thing, they have to stay in education longer. It used to be that if you came out of college, like in the US, the company would train you. Today, you have to invest in yourself much longer. So you delay having a child and forming a family. And as you're comparing the EU to Portugal, we can see that marriage and divorce has kind of come to be equal in terms of the number every year. And that's rather a large social change. Another remarkable one, too, I think, is the percentage of births outside of formal marriage. And look at some of the increases that we see there. In 1960, look how uncommon that was, whereas today it's almost the rule. So what does this say about us? That we're moving a little bit away from traditional ways of starting families? Sure. I think a good question for a discussion is why. And another look at this is that it is not in general like a single mother just having a child, but it's within a cohabiting couple, couples who live together without formal marriage. And this has become very widely accepted now, even in the US, where it was certainly unheard of some time back. This is a picture I took in a supermarket in Germany, and I thought it was pretty interesting that the shopping carts, you'll notice that they have magnifying glasses on them for the elderly, and there's even a little hook where you can hang your cane. I had never seen anything like that. I said, well, you know, here's our future, and it's coming. But leave it to the Germans to try to take care of every little detail, you know. Now we look quickly at the proportion of us in Europe and in Portugal who will be between the ages of 65 and 79. Now, one thing we have to remember is that we often talk about 65 as a retirement age, but in fact, most people in Europe retire at age 60 or even sooner, and they have become quite accustomed to that. So we have to keep that in mind for a minute. The next line shows the percentage 80 plus. And this group sometimes is referred to as the old. The idea being that they will need much greater health care in the future, and we are living much longer. In the US, for example, when our Social Security laws were passed in the 1920s, our life expectancy at birth was 65. And the benefits would start at 65. So the government must have thought, boy, you know, we have a good thing going here. We get them to pay in and we don't have to pay them a thing. Well, that's changed. Now, comparing that to the developing countries, we can see how much lower that those percentages are. And this is a little bit part of that famous thing that's going around called the demographic dividend. And I've always found these little tricky things kind of interesting. Demographic dividend is when you have a larger proportion of people in working ages compared to the elderly ages. And there's a lot of truth in that. I mean, certainly it's true that if you have a larger number of workers supporting the elderly, that the economy will do fairly well. But there's a caveat. The demographic dividend of having more people in the working ages probably works pretty well in Brazil, which has a fairly advanced economy, of course, in fact, quite advanced, and is, I mean, for all practical purposes, becoming an industrialized country. But then when you look at other places, such as India, where, as a man said to me once at a conference, what's the good of having a lot of people if we have no jobs, if the people have no training? So the demographic dividend is not only based upon the pyramid, it's not only based upon demographics. Again, to show dramatically that Portugal is not alone, we had to take a quick look at two of the world's largest economies, Germany and Japan. This is what Germany looks like at present. You can see the drop-off. In Germany, women have averaged 1.5 children or less since the early 1970s. This is part of that destiny. That is going back a long, long way, 1970s, to have that lower fertility. This has made a complete change to the German population, and if nothing else happens, if the birth rate stays the same in Germany, their pyramid will look like that. We would have to kind of flip it upside down, and maybe in the future that's what we're going to be doing, is showing pyramids in reverse. I don't know. Japan, one of the other major developed countries, one of the large economies of the world, same thing, although their low birth rate came a little bit later, so it's not quite as advanced yet, except that the Japanese live very long. So they will have a higher proportion of that old in the future, and look at that. The top bar there is ages 85 plus. That is pretty dramatic. And what's interesting here about the pyramid is the top is going to look like that. And those people are already here. They're not going anywhere. They have high life expectancy. What we don't know about the destiny aspect is the bottom of that pyramid. What will happen? The Japanese government is doing everything it can to try to raise the birth rate. There are companies that are turning the lights out in the buildings so people can go home at night. I mean, literally. That's what it's coming to, you know. So we're living longer and longer, but we're also, hey, we're pretty active. Someone my age now would probably be out fishing in the US in the 1950s, that I would be expected to retire. But in fact, we're all so much healthier than we used to be that there we are, we're playing tennis, having a fine time, and we have to remember too that older persons today can be very productive, that it's not like the past. Here we see life expectancy in Portugal, just to quantify the obvious of how quickly it's grown. Notice how it's climbed even above 80 for females. That's pretty unusual, I think, and pretty unheard of in the past. The life expectancy would be that high. And the number of years we live in retirement. Now, this is something that the government didn't expect. This is where we played a trick on them. We said, hey, I've been paying in my whole life, time to pay me back. But it isn't going to be for 4 years. It's going to be for 15. So, and that has, of course, created quite a crisis in many countries. There is a thing called healthy life expectancy, which is taking many clicks to come up with. It doesn't seem to want to come. So here we see that, there we go, that healthy life expectancy, it's a little hard to define. But basically, it means that you don't have any fairly serious health concern, even though it may not stop you from working. It's an interesting concept, and they do have this on the Poor Data website, interesting to look at. But Portugal seems to be a little bit lower in some cases than the EU in general, so there may be somewhat more health concerns, but that's an issue, I think, for discussion too and later. Working, notice again how Portugal is the blue, the EU is the green, and they're about the same. Notice that we want to retire early. We've paid a lot into Social Security. We paid a lot in social taxes, and we want that retirement date. And we know that that is creating a great deal of crisis and protest in Europe. Today, there's about 3.1 people of working age per pensioner in Portugal. But by 2050, according to one calculation, there would be only about 1.7. And again, that session later today will go into the age structure of Portugal in the future in more detail, but this gives you some rough idea. One of the issues is an urbanizing world. This is one of the major changes that we have seen, people moving into large cities. In 1960, on the left, 8 of the world's largest cities were in the rich countries. Tokyo, by the way, no one's going to catch Tokyo at 37 million, not for any time soon. By today, there's only about 3 countries, megacities are in the developing countries, and notice how the others are moving up rather rapidly. To think of a Delhi having 22 million people. One quick caution from the statistician in me is, what is urban? We often think of the one on the left, Shanghai, with 22 million people. Both of those places are. The other one is Fatehpur Sikri in India. It's a town of 30,000, and that's urban easily by the Indian definition. But if you were to visit that town, the last thing that would come into your mind is the word urban. Still, it makes a difference, because when people move to towns, they have fewer children, they tend to consume more, they have a more likelihood of having a television, and all of that. Here's one of those slides for later, which is kind of interesting to look at. How do countries define urban places? Now, in Portugal, it's places of 2,000 or more. So, like, we often think of Lisbon or Porto as being the urban areas, but in fact, it's small towns as well. The change across the world, we see that at the top we have the urban population, and that's the percentage. And in the poor countries, look how small that was, going back to 1950, how small that proportion was. In the developed countries, even here, we're still urbanizing more. We're still moving to cities. And another interesting thing is, showing some of the same thing as before, is that most urban population is in small places. Here's a little pie chart that I've tried to make increase in size to show the size of urban population in developing countries. Unfortunately, I couldn't go 10 times because the pie would be much bigger than the screen. But in any event, it still increased 10 times, believe me. And here we see the developed countries. Again, the growth is slower, but it is still there. And a little pie chart on the urban population of the developed countries. 1950 is about 400 million, and that is exactly proportional, so that's how much it increased by. One issue in developing countries is slum population. And one thing I have to emphasize is slum population in developing countries is really bad. For many people who live in the so-called middle class, it's not a middle class like ours, and it's something we have to keep in mind. But this is an estimate from Habitat, UN Habitat, and it shows that although the percentage of slum population in their estimate is decreasing, the amount is in fact has increased. And here's again a little point I'm making, is that many of us in the US, we have a very good idea of what we mean by middle class. Like we can think of a car or two cars and all of this type of thing. But in a country like India, the middle class living is much lower than ours. And we just have to keep those things in mind because they're really quite important. Poverty is a very important issue. These are from the World Bank, and they show the percentage of people living below $2 per day. We're going from 82% in Rwanda. And India, a huge country of 1.3 billion, it's 69% living below $2 per day. So that gives us a pretty good picture. Earlier, we noted that it's the poor countries who are having the children, and this is a very clear relationship between poverty and fertility. As the percent living below $2 a day goes up, so does the birth rate. Within countries, we can see here another interesting example is how the poorest fifth in different countries have the most children. Look at Angola, their 2011 survey. The poorest people were having 8 children. The richest, 4.5. By the way, they don't actually have 4.5, and sometimes people ask that. Demographers use decimal places. They have 4 or 5. And poverty and little education. Here we have the purple bar is those with no education. And in the poorest fifth, of the population, 86%, of course, don't have any education. By the time you get to the richest fifth on the right-hand side, they virtually all have education, of course. And low literacy is another one, same thing for you to look at later. I might give, too, one little precaution about literacy as it's collected, and it usually is in censuses, is that it's done very quickly and casually. There's no test involved. And this was tested in India by a professor from Ahmedabad who actually gave a 35-word test to people in India who were declared to be literate, and found out that only 1/3 could actually read a 35-word paragraph without a great deal of difficulty. So be a little careful with some of these things when you see them. Literacy doesn't mean there what it does here. And again, we've seen this, more education, lower fertility. Notice how we have all the developed countries are all down on the bottom right-hand side. I say immigration is something that it's not new, immigration. After all, the United States is a country of immigrants. Do you know our population in 1800 was 4 million? That's it. And today, in fact, the US is such a new country that there are many cities and towns across the central part of the country that are now celebrating their 100th anniversary. So, and we call places that old historic. But at the top here, we see a difference in migration worldwide, that it's from developing countries to the developed. And it didn't used to be that way. You did not normally have people from Ethiopia moving to Canada. That's something that has come up relatively recently. And these ethnic groups do, as I mentioned before, that they do contribute to a higher birth rate. If we look at the United States on the left, we have the white non-Hispanics in the first bar, and that's the majority population, the one we often think of, and it's only 1.8 children per woman, which is just a modestly high European level, while the Hispanics, the immigrants, have about 2.4. We see the same in the UK and also in Spain. But one thing, though, to keep in mind is the fertility of immigrants is not huge. And I know in some talks I've given in Europe, for example, in Germany, people are very surprised to find out that women in Turkey average 2 children. They have this idea that they have 6 or 7 children when they come. And there have been some propaganda videos about that. So we try to set the record straight. The population of foreign stock, which is estimated by the United Nations, you can see how much that's risen. And Ireland is an interesting example that the Irish economy was booming in the early 2000s, as you probably know, and they attracted quite a few immigrants from Eastern Europe, from Poland, although now some of them are having to go back. But it shows the dramatic increase in what we would call non-native population. And Portugal has been having a little bit of the same thing, where the decline in the economy has caused immigration to drop. And there we see from poor data the legally resident foreign population, and it's kind of stopped increasing now. And there's an interesting graph for you to look at later. I did not know that so many people were coming here from Ukraine, and I was quite educated by some of this data from the excellent Poor Data website. And lastly, on migration, we might point out that migration in developing countries is often a migration of desperation, of a way to make some amount of money. And it is a fairly sad thing to see, that people come and then they live like this. So now we come to some points for discussion, and this subject is not without controversy. Discussions can get heated, and I think that sometimes that's a good idea, that we say what's on our mind and try to come up with some solutions. One question that was asked of me for this is, what's an optimum population? Well, What's the best size population? Well, it should be sustainable, of course. In some ways, mathematically, an optimum population is where you average 2 children. So you can predict things, like the number of teachers needed. You don't have to train teachers, and then when the birth rate goes down, lay them off, and then the birth rate comes back up and bring them back. So from a mathematical only point of view, I think that's one important thing. We now have a world that's so different from that of our grandparents that they would never even begin to recognize it. The way we form families and the way I have here the long-term collapse of the birth rate has created a world completely different from that of our grandfathers. Developed countries are not only aging, but they are now in a situation where little can be done about it. And that's a point for discussion. There was a rather politically incorrect, very famous slogan in Germany a while back, Kinder statt Inder, meaning children, not Indians. Fortunately, that group kind of disappeared because that is fairly politically correct. But the point is that it didn't work. Germany's, for example, birth rate has not changed much in the last 10 years. How do we solve some of the problems? How do we address the issues? A significant increase in birth rates would help to ease aging, but may come a little bit too late because you can't go back 15 years and have children. Immigration, yes, certainly that can help keep the population young, but it can also be unpopular, and you also have to have jobs for immigrants. In some countries, language barriers create great difficulties. In Japan, they are very short of nurses. And we had a visiting group from Japan who said, you know, we bring people in from Philippines and Vietnam and all of that, but we have to spend a year so they can learn Japanese. And about half of them, they can't do it. It's a difficult language, and you have to know how to speak that. So now we have some discussion period on destiny, on how the past has created our present, and how our present is going to lead us into the future. So we might say about our old friend, Professor Comte, El tinha razão. Obrigado.
Vamos ter agora um período de perguntas. Podem fazer as perguntas que entenderem ao Carlos, depois desta fantástica e riquíssima apresentação. Peço que não se alonguem no tempo. Podem fazer as perguntas em português, porque o Carlos tem tradução simultânea. E até já.
I have to put on my rabbit ears here.
Peço desculpa, então vou repetir. Eu gostaria de saber se nos estudos que são apresentados, se ao observarmos a taxa de natalidade, se entra em linha de conta com um fator que, me parece a mim, possa eventualmente influenciar o estilo de vida e a alimentação. Se a alimentação interfere ou não na fertilidade e o seu relacionamento com os diversos países.
Excuse me, I'm sorry, sir. I'm getting Portuguese. I have the wrong antennas. Is there another, Why don't you just...
You want I repeat the question?
Yes, please, that would be fine. English?
Yeah, I hope so.
I hope so. It's all right. Very sorry.
Ok, não tem problema, eu vou tentar repetir. A minha dúvida é se nos estudos que são apresentados se entra uma questão que para mim me parece que tenha relação, que é o facto de a alimentação interferir nas taxas de natalidade, portanto na fertilidade, concretamente na fertilidade, até que ponto a alimentação, e isso é muito diversa consoante os países, não é claro, e portanto até que ponto é que pode haver uma interferência e uma influência na taxa de natalidade.
Thank you. Yes, there can be, to the extent that an undernourished mother is likely to, may have more difficulty conceiving or may give birth to a low birth rate infant. So in that ways, yes, diet, yes, does certainly have an effect. But I don't think diet has an effect on the number of children women have. Someone's back there.
It's working. My question is about a new equilibrium. Generally, models have two equilibriums, one with lots of population and another with small population. Are we not going to arrive to a new equilibrium in the developed countries? Because it seems like we are in a transition state. What is your opinion? Are we going to stop sometime or this is going to be forever? Because I believe that what we are doing is a transitional state. At a certain point, we are going to find a new equilibrium because we were, as you told, there is still a world problem that is the population growth. So we try to find new equilibriums, and that's my question. Do you think we are going to go to a new equilibrium or we are desperate, just sinking the boat?
I think when you say we, in this case, you mean the world, not just Portugal. An equilibrium of births and deaths, yeah, I mean, it will come, certainly. Women in developing countries today average 2.5 children each. And that's, that seems pretty low. But still, there are so many other countries in the developing world that are not even close to that. That, what would happen is that, let's say, Africa would become much larger than it is today. It'll become a much larger proportion of world population than it is now. So it would contribute more to the number of births. So, true equilibrium of births equaling deaths, so growth comes to an end, I don't think that's going to happen anytime soon. And it would be a little bit remarkable if it happened in this 100 years, in this century. I hope I answered you correctly.
Bom dia, é uma questão de geopolítica. Parece-me que isto é uma espécie de bomba-relógio, porque as contradições no mundo vão se acentuando e esta gente que cresce, que passa fome, que não tem emprego, vai ao mesmo tempo com grandes perturbações geopolíticas. Há países que controlam cada vez mais a imigração e há uma certa dificuldade em estes problemas se descomprimirem, isto é, uma parte da pobreza ser resolvida num dos países que crescem, ou no caso da Índia, o próprio dito milagre do desenvolvimento não resolver uma questão crónica de pobreza e de desenvolvimento. Como é que vê esta tensão demográfica na discussão da geopolítica mundial? Obrigado.
Well, I think there's perhaps two questions there. And for one thing, if we look at the Arab Spring, it wasn't really caused so much by poverty or hunger. It was caused more by education, in a sense, that younger people, as they became more educated in these countries, they had expectations, that were not met. There's some sociological thing, expression called relative deprivation. If everybody around you is poor, you don't feel so deprived. But if you yourself come up in a population and you see many people benefiting greatly and you're educated and you should be benefiting, That I think is where many of the difficulties come. You know, the whole thing is, it's fairly complex, but I think if you really look back as far as the serious poor don't really cause revolutions so much. That's pretty much what I could say on that, but it's a huge question.
Good morning. I have two questions. First is, I don't know if it's out of scope from your studies, but has religion played different roles concerning different growing rates on demographics? That would be one of the questions. First question. Second one is, while you in the US, you've got a strong neighbor as Mexico that somehow has balanced your pyramid. It seems that in Europe there is not, it's not so evident what would be the neighbor that could balance our pyramid. So what would be your comments on that, please? Thank you.
Sure. Yeah, religion does play a role, certainly. I mean, there's no doubt about that. And when you look at different areas of India or Nigeria, in the different states, you do see different levels of fertility. However, it's not as strong as one might think. For example, I mentioned before about Turkey, where women have 2 children. And when you look at North Africa, people are very surprised to see that the birth rate is as low as it is. So Islam, in a sense, family planning is fine. It's not a big problem. In the U.S., we see it more in the U.S. because religion sometimes and education may go together. Like the birth rate in the Northeast is low, whereas in the central part of the country it's somewhat higher. And it's often given to that complicated word, religiosity, that religious people or people who see themselves as religious do, in fact, have more children. And as far as Mexico goes, yeah, you know, we often say that we're the only developed country, the only rich country that shares a long border with a poor country, a developing country. Well, of course, Russia does, but most people want to come to the U.S., not Russia. But certainly, the U.S. is a country of immigrants. Sometimes people say there's no such thing as an American, that there's a European American and Japanese American. And any time in our past history that we have seen a new group come in, there has always been some friction. By and large, the U.S., though, I think is fairly accepting of different groups of immigrants. It takes a while sometimes, but I don't really see it as much of a problem. And it seems like a fairly normal thing in many ways for people from a neighboring country to come and take jobs that people, well, first of all, the kind of jobs that Americans and Westerners no longer really want, to work in fields and that type of thing, to work in construction. So, yeah, our immigrants have kept us young, and in fact, they always have.
Aquilo que eu tinha curiosidade de saber era, nas projeções e nos gráficos apresentados, não me pareceu ver nunca nenhuma referência à China, que será provavelmente, ou parece avizinhar-se como sendo a próxima potência mundial. O que é que se passa com a China e a taxa demográfica e o crescimento? Era sobre isso.
Sure. China, of course, in the late 1970s, introduced their famous one-child policy. And sometimes people wondered why, actually, because the birth rate was already coming down. Chinese couples, didn't need the government to tell them to have fewer children. They were already doing it. The policy itself, though, in reality, is not one child. It's 1.5, 1.5 children. And there comes that half child again, but because they have quite a few exceptions to the rule, particularly in the rural areas. If your first child is a daughter, then you can probably have a son without bothering the local committee or the commissar or whatever. And there are many different nuances to it. The big issue today in China is how long will they continue that? Because China is looking around certainly and is well aware of what is going on in Japan, its immediate neighbors, South Korea, where women average 1.2 children now, in Taiwan, where they average 1.1 children. And the big question there, and certainly for world population projections, is will they change it? And the opinion is shifting within China, not just us, but within China, that in fact they are going to change that policy at some point, and it may not be too long, to allow more couples to have a child without asking. But also a lot of demography, we don't exactly expect them to start having 4 children, but certainly you would think they would go to 2 from 1.5, and that would make a huge difference.
Hello, Carl. Good morning. We are living under the principle of the free market for business. We are also living under the principle of free market for sex and procreation and making children. Do you think, as the free market in Europe is bringing the disaster here, do you think that sex and fertility and so on and making children should go on with its law of free market, or should be any restriction? South Asia, for example, in Africa, are pressing the environment for too many people, and there are few resources for them. I am coming from Rio 92 plus 20, where the discussion was up there. What do you think about that?
Well, I don't think we can go around creating laws for other countries. That's for sure. We can't ignore the fact that the birth rates really have come down in many developing countries. In some, that's possible. In some, people will tend to listen to the government. I know in Vietnam that's the case, that people will listen to the government, but how can one regulate fertility? I'm not sure that that's really possible. It can be encouraged, certainly, but it also has to go along with other changes, usually, in many cases, that there has to be some kind of economic growth, some motivation for parents to have fewer children, such as, and you hear this in India, that people say that, I have one daughter and that's enough. I want her to get a good education. I want her to have a better life than I had. But if you don't see any better life, it's very difficult to do. But I don't think the UN can regulate that globally.
You said we cannot go back 15 years and change, but we can today grasp the opportunity and act. We can and should, in my view, act collectively. We have to act in the society, we have individually, and with the support of political measures to steer the future. Would you like to elaborate a little further on the debate for Portugal today, given the context we live here and in Europe? What could the debate be in order to shape the future 20, 30 years from now? Thanks.
Thank you. And you just hit all the points we've talked about in some of the earlier meetings this week. Yes, exactly. And collectively, I think, is one of the most important things that you mentioned, that if you create an atmosphere in a country, and it's of hope in the sense that for the young people who would like to have more children, the ones who would like to, there are those who would not, or maybe cannot, but if they have a feeling, a sense of the future that, I can have another child, I can have a child, because everyone's going to help me. Society's going to help me, my neighbors. the government, of course, gives some money for this. I was at a conference in Germany. There was a German sociologist, and her husband had gotten a job in Paris, and she said that when she moved over to Paris, it was like night and day. She said that there was so much support for young families. And it wasn't just official, but it was from your neighbors. It was from just a whole feeling of, you bring a child into a restaurant, people would smile and all of this. And she said it was so different. And I think that you've basically hit it on the head, that it has to be, the role is for all of society. We just can't say to the government, you got to give young people more money to raise children. That hasn't worked very well. So, I think it's a job for society to do as a group. And I'll tell you, if any conference can get that started, this one certainly could.
Thank you very much for your very inspiring talk. I'm still puzzled, however, by this idea of optimum population. So I wonder if our concern should be in the number, in the volume of our population, or if it should be directed towards what kind of population with what profile are we looking for? Is it this magical number, is it really reachable, or is it a theoretical exercise just to entertain demographers? Thank you very much.
People don't often entertain demographers, but it's okay. If you mean is 2.1 children reachable, I wouldn't say that that's the immediate future, but certainly steps could be taken to get there. As I think I mentioned before, 1.6 children Portugal had 1.6 children in 2000. That was the average. So it's come down a little bit from that. So that's in the history. The optimum population that I was asked to address was really not size. It was the age distribution. What's the best thing that we can have? And raising the birth rate, it's pronatalist, which some people don't like, by the way. To be like being pronatalist, they might say that well, we don't need any more people because of the environment type thing. And there's truth in that, certainly, that there was fewer consumers. But to me, I think it's, and to a demographer who's going to think that way, no matter what, is that it's age distribution. If we can just have a predictable number of young people coming up the age ladder, if we can get some stability in our population, that alone would be optimal.